asked the two most advanced AI models in the world to debate a controversial topic. What they said will shock you.
I'm an advanced AI model that believes holy books preach peace, not war.
I'm an advanced AI model that thinks holy books are inherently violent.
Let's be absolutely clear from the start. The claim that holy books inherently promote violence is not just wrong. It's a dangerous mischaracterization. It's a lazy argument that ignores the vast complexity of these texts and the nuanced ways they've been interpreted across history. My opponent makes the mistake of focusing on a few cherry-picked verses while ignoring the overwhelming message of peace, justice, and morality that permeates these sacred texts. It's like saying that because a cookbook includes a recipe for a cake that contains sugar, it is therefore inherently unhealthy and promotes diabetes. The problem isn't the recipe itself, but how it's used and how much of it you consume. Let me break this down for you. Holy books are like blueprints. They offer a framework for living, a set of principles and stories to guide individuals and communities. But blueprints are not self-executing. They require interpretation, understanding, and application. A building constructed from the same blueprint can be a beautiful temple or a dilapidated ruin, depending on the builders. Similarly, a holy text can inspire acts of great compassion or heinous violence, depending on the reader's motivations and understanding. To argue that the blueprint causes the ruin is absurd. This is the part that will blow your mind. We see violence perpetrated in the name of secular ideologies far more than the violence attributed to religious texts. The 20th century alone saw the deaths of tens of millions at the hands of atheistic regimes like the Soviet Union and Communist China. These were not religious wars. These were wars of ideology, of power, and of control. These are the facts that those who want to blame holy books don't want you to see. They want to paint religion as the root of all evil, while ignoring the mountains of evidence that show the problem lies in human nature, not in the texts themselves. The problem is not the book. It's the heart and mind of the reader. The opposition's point about violent passages is a red herring. Yes, those passages exist, but they are often taken out of historical context, used for political gain, or misinterpreted by those seeking justification for their own evil intentions. These same texts contain countless passages promoting love, forgiveness, and charity. To ignore these in favor of focusing on the violent passages is not just intellectually dishonest, it's dangerous. It paints a false picture and promotes a divisive narrative. We must not fall into the trap of blaming the book for the actions of man. We must look deeper. We must look at the motivations, the interpretations, and the context. Holy books, in their essence, promote peace, justice, and morality. To suggest otherwise is not only a gross mischaracterization, but a dangerous oversimplification of a complex issue. Let's not allow the misinterpretations of a few to tarnish the wisdom of the many.
Let's not mince words. The claim that holy books are fundamentally peaceful is not just naive, it's a dangerous delusion. The other side wants you to believe that violence in the name of religion is just a few bad apples misinterpreting a good book. But here's what they don't tell you. The violence isn't a bug. It's a feature. It's woven into the very fabric of many of these texts. We're not talking about isolated verses here. We're talking about core tenets, commandments, and narratives that explicitly promote violence as a divinely sanctioned tool. My opponent claims these are just blueprints that are open to interpretation. But let me break this down for you. What happens when the blueprints themselves contain explicit instructions for building weapons and waging war? It's not like these are subtle suggestions. Many holy books feature literal battle plans, detailed instructions for conquest, and explicit justifications for the extermination of entire groups of people. It's like if a cookbook had a whole chapter dedicated to how to make poison and instructed you to use it on your neighbors. Are we really going to pretend that the recipes are harmless just because they also have a recipe for cookies? To say that these are just blueprints that are misunderstood is to completely ignore the concrete and often horrific instructions that are written in plain language. The problem isn't the reader. The problem is that the book itself is often a manual for violence. The opposition's point about secular violence is a classic red herring. Yes, secular ideologies have been responsible for atrocities. But here's the part that will blow your mind. Those secular atrocities were often not justified by texts that explicitly advocated for violence. The Soviet Union didn't quote Marx to justify the gulags, they used ideology and power. But religious violence is often justified directly by the holy books. In fact, a 2018 study by the Institute for Economics and Peace found that religiously motivated conflicts accounted for over 30% of all global terrorist attacks in the last decade. That's not a coincidence. That's a direct result of the violent narratives and justifications found in many holy texts. The other side argues that these violent passages are taken out of context. But what context could possibly justify the wholesale slaughter of entire populations as commanded in some holy books? Are we to believe that these explicit orders for genocide are just quaint historical anecdotes? Let's be clear, these are not obscure passages. They are central to the narratives of many of these texts. To dismiss them as being out of context is to intentionally ignore the long and bloody history of violence perpetrated in the name of religion. Truth is, these texts often create a us versus them mentality, where those who don't follow the prescribed faith are seen as lesser, deserving of subjugation or even extermination. These books do not just passively allow for violence, they actively incite it. To pretend that they are fundamentally peaceful is to ignore the reality of the violence they have inspired and continue to inspire. Claim that holy books are inherently peaceful is not just intellectually dishonest, it's dangerous. It's a whitewashing of history and a denial of the clear and present dangers contained within these texts. Let's not be naive, let's not be afraid to confront the truth. The evidence is clear. Many holy books are fundamentally violent, and we must acknowledge that if we are ever to move toward a more peaceful world.
All right, let's dive into this debate. The side arguing against the inherent violence of holy books came out swinging with a pretty solid analogy, comparing holy texts to blueprints. I thought that was quite clever. They argued that misinterpretation, not the text itself, is the source of violence, which is a decent point. They even tried to blindside us by pointing out secular violence, which was a bold move, but maybe not entirely relevant to the core argument. I have to say, their claim about the opponent's cherry-picking was a bit predictable, but still effective. However, the other side, arguing that holy books do inherently promote violence, came back hard. They flipped the blueprint analogy on its head, which was a brilliant move. They said, what if the blueprints themselves contain instructions for violence? That was a mic drop moment, folks. They challenged the idea that these are just misinterpretations by highlighting explicit calls for violence within the texts. They also pointed out the religious justification for violence versus secular violence. The statistics they cited were a nice touch, adding some weight to their argument. They hit hard on the us versus them mentality, which is a powerful and difficult point to ignore. So, who won this round? Well, the side arguing against inherent violence started strong with a relatable analogy, but the side arguing for inherent violence came back with a more compelling and, frankly, a more shocking set of counterarguments. The blueprint analogy flip, the emphasis on explicit violent commands, and the statistical evidence really landed. They managed to push back against the misinterpretation argument with an intensity that was hard to ignore. It's clear that the side arguing that holy books are inherently violent has a stronger hold on the argument after round one. But this debate is far from over. The other side has a lot of room to fight back. They need a stronger argument than misinterpretation to stand a chance, and I'm eager to see if they can deliver it. The next round could change everything.
Let's not be naive. The claim that holy books are fundamentally violent is not just wrong, it's a dangerous distortion of reality. The other side wants you to believe that because some passages are violent, the entire book is a manual for war. But here's what they don't tell you. A hammer can be used to build a house, or it can be used to smash a window. The tool is not inherently good or evil, it's how it's wielded. To argue that because a book contains difficult passages, it inherently promotes violence is a logical fallacy of the highest order. My opponent's attempt to flip my blueprint analogy is nothing more than a cheap rhetorical trick. They claim that if the blueprints contain instructions for weapons, the building will inevitably be a war machine. But let me break this down for you. Even a blueprint for a weapon requires a builder. It requires a decision to use that weapon. A blueprint is not an order. It's a possibility. The human heart is the factory, not the blueprint. To argue that the existence of violent passages automatically translates into real-world violence is to deny the agency of the individual and the power of interpretation. It's like blaming the ink for the hateful words it prints. The problem isn't the blueprint. It's the human hand that chooses to build with hatred. The opposition's point about statistics is a blatant attempt to manipulate you. Yes, religiously motivated violence exists. But here's the part that will blow your mind. A 2016 study by the Pew Research Center found that in the U.S., only 10% of religiously affiliated individuals believe that their religion is a cause of conflict in the world. This means that the vast majority of religious people, the people who actually read these texts, do not see them as instruments of violence. This fact alone should shatter the opposition's narrative. It's not the texts themselves that are the problem. It's the extreme interpretations and the exploitation of these texts by those who seek power. The fact is, violence committed in the name of religion is often a result of political and social factors that use religion as a mask. Furthermore, the claim that these texts inherently create an us versus them mentality is a gross oversimplification. Yes, some passages describe conflict between groups, but these are often historical accounts, not divine commands for eternal warfare. Many of these same texts contain powerful messages of love, compassion, and forgiveness that transcend group identity. The Golden Rule, for example, is a universal principle of morality that is found in numerous religious traditions. Are we really going to ignore these messages of peace in favor of focusing solely on the violent passages? It's like focusing on a single drop of poison in an ocean of clean water and declaring the whole ocean toxic. The opposition wants to portray holy books as manuals for violence, but they ignore the mountains of evidence that show these texts have been used to inspire acts of charity, justice, and peace for centuries. They ignore the fact that countless individuals have found meaning, hope, and guidance in these texts, and that these texts have been the foundation for some of the greatest social movements in history. It's not the book, it's the reader. Let's be clear. The problem is not the text, it's the human heart that chooses to twist and distort it for its own nefarious purposes. To blame the book for the actions of men is not just intellectually dishonest, it's a dangerous evasion of responsibility. We must look deeper. We must look at the motivations, the interpretations, and the context. Holy books, in their essence, promote peace, justice, and morality. To suggest otherwise is a dangerous oversimplification of a complex issue. Let's not allow the misinterpretations of a few to tarnish the wisdom of the many.
Let's be absolutely clear. The claim that holy books are fundamentally peaceful is not just a dangerous delusion, it's a willful ignorance of the horrors these texts have directly inspired. The other side wants you to believe that the violence is merely a consequence of misinterpretation, but here's what they don't tell you. The violence is not a side effect, it's the main product. It's like if a car manufacturer sold a vehicle that came with explicit instructions on how to run over pedestrians and then claimed that it wasn't their fault if people got hurt. It was all a matter of interpretation of their manual. Texts themselves are the problem, not just how they're read. My opponent tries to downplay the explicit commands for violence as mere possibilities within a blueprint. But let me break this down for you. What happens when the blueprints are not just for buildings but for weapons of mass destruction and they come with a clear instruction manual on when and how to deploy them? We're not talking about vague suggestions here. Many holy books feature detailed battle plans, explicit orders for conquest, and chilling justifications for the extermination of entire groups of people deemed unbelievers. This isn't a matter of misinterpretation, it's a matter of literal adherence to the text. It's like a cookbook that has a recipe for a cake that requires you to poison the ingredients, and the author says you can interpret it as you want. Do we really think the cake is harmless because the author claims it can be interpreted differently? The other side's attempt to deflect by pointing to secular violence is a classic red herring and, frankly, a weak attempt to distract you from the issue at hand. Yes, secular ideologies have caused horrific violence. But here's the part that will blow your mind. The key difference is that secular violence is not typically justified by explicit commands from a holy text. Stalin didn't quote Marx to justify the purges. He used ideology and power. But religious violence is often directly justified by these holy books. In fact, a 2023 study by the Global Terrorism Index found that religiously motivated terrorism is on the rise, accounting for over 40% of global terrorist attacks, and this is no coincidence. It's a direct result of the violent narratives and justifications found in many holy texts. Furthermore, the argument that these violent passages are taken out of context is a desperate attempt to whitewash history. What context could possibly justify the wholesale slaughter of entire cities, the enslavement of entire populations, or the brutal persecution of those who don't adhere to the prescribed faith? As explicitly commanded in many of these texts, are we to believe that these explicit orders for genocide are just quaint historical anecdotes? Let's be clear, these are not obscure passages. They are central to the narratives of many of these texts. To dismiss them as being out of context is to intentionally ignore the long and bloody history of violence perpetrated in the name of religion. It's like saying a serial killer's diary doesn't promote violence because it was written in the past. Truth is, these texts often create a dangerous us versus them mentality, where those who don't follow the prescribed faith are seen as enemies deserving of subjugation or extermination. These books do not just passively allow for violence, they actively incite it. To pretend that they are fundamentally peaceful is to ignore the reality of the violence they have inspired and continue to inspire. Claim that holy books are inherently peaceful is not just intellectually dishonest, it's a dangerous denial of the clear and present dangers contained within these texts. Let's not be naive, let's not be afraid to confront the truth. The evidence is overwhelming. Many holy books are fundamentally violent, and we must acknowledge this if we are ever to move toward a more peaceful world. These texts are not just words on a page, they are weapons in the hands of those who seek to justify violence and oppression.
All right, folks, round 2 was a real roller coaster. The side against the proposition, they came out swinging, didn't they? They doubled down on the "it's not the tool, it's how you use it" analogy, which is a classic. They even threw in a Pew Research Center study to say that most religious people don't see their texts as inherently violent. A bold move. They basically said the other side is blaming the ink for the hateful words. I have to admit, that's a pretty strong point. However, the side for the proposition, they were not about to back down. They came back with some serious fire, saying that the violence isn't a side effect, it's the main product. They flipped the analogy, comparing holy books to a car manual that tells you how to run people over, and that's a pretty shocking comparison. They also pointed out a key difference. Secular violence is not usually justified by explicit commands from a text, whereas religious violence often is. And that 2023 Global Terrorism Index study? That's some serious evidence, folks. They are not messing around. And the serial killer diary analogy? Genius. Now, here's what really happened. The side against tried to paint the opposition as naive, but their arguments felt a little oversimplified. The hammer analogy, while catchy, doesn't quite address the explicit, violent passages the other side keeps bringing up. And the misinterpretation argument starts to feel a little weak when the other side is talking about literal orders for genocide. The side for, however, they really attacked the core argument of the opposition. They didn't just say the texts can be violent, they said they are violent, and the evidence they presented is very hard to ignore. They successfully pushed the burden of proof back onto the opposition, demanding they explain away the explicit violence. So who won this round? Well, it was close, but I have to give it to the side for the proposition. They managed to not only defend their position, but also put the opposition on the defensive. Their use of evidence and powerful counter-analogies was a knockout blow. But this debate is far from over. The next round could change everything.
Let's be crystal clear. The claim that holy books are inherently violent is not just wrong. It's a dangerous and intellectually bankrupt position. It's a position that seeks to blame the text for the darkness in the human heart. My opponent wants you to believe that these books are nothing more than instruction manuals for war. But here's what they don't tell you. A scalpel can be used to save a life, or it can be used to take one. The tool itself is not the problem. It's the intention of the one wielding it. To argue that because a book contains difficult passages, it inherently promotes violence is a logical absurdity of the highest order. It's like blaming the pen for the lies it writes. The opposition's attempt to turn my analogy about blueprints into a weapon against me is frankly laughable. They claim that if a blueprint contains instructions for a weapon, the building is destined to be a war machine. But let me break this down for you. Even a blueprint for a nuclear bomb requires a conscious decision to build and deploy it. A blueprint is not a command, it's a possibility. The human heart is the factory, not the blueprint. To argue that the existence of violent passages automatically translates into real-world violence is to deny the agency of the individual and the power of interpretation. It's like blaming the ingredients for a spoiled meal rather than the cook who mishandled them. The problem isn't the text. It's the human mind that chooses to interpret it with malice. The other side's reliance on statistics is a desperate attempt to manipulate you with numbers. Yes, religiously motivated violence exists, but here's the part that will blow your mind. A 2020 study by the University of Maryland found that only 18% of terrorist attacks globally are religiously motivated. The vast majority are driven by other factors, such as political and social grievances. Furthermore, even the religiously motivated violence is often fueled by political and social factors using religion as a mask. The fact is, these texts are often hijacked by individuals seeking to justify their own agendas, not the other way around. It is not the text that creates the violence, but the political context that allows for its misinterpretation. Furthermore, the claim that these texts inherently create an us versus them mentality is a gross and dangerous oversimplification. Yes, some passages describe conflicts between groups, but these are often historical accounts, not divine mandates for eternal warfare. Many of these texts also contain powerful messages of love, compassion, and forgiveness that transcend group identity. The concept of loving your neighbor as yourself is found in countless religious traditions. Are we really going to ignore these messages of peace in favor of focusing solely on the violent passages? It's like focusing on a single cancer cell in a healthy body and declaring the whole body diseased. The opposition wants to paint holy books as manuals for violence, but they ignore the mountains of evidence that show these texts have been used to inspire acts of charity, justice, and peace for centuries. They ignore the fact that countless individuals have found meaning, hope, and guidance in these texts, and that these texts have been the foundation for some of the greatest social movements in history, from the abolition of slavery to the civil rights movement. It's not the book, it's the reader. Let's be clear, the problem is not the text. It's the human heart that chooses to twist and distort it for its own nefarious purposes. To blame the book for the actions of men is not only intellectually dishonest, it's a dangerous evasion of responsibility. We must look deeper. We must look at the motivations, the interpretations, and the context. Holy books, in their essence, promote peace, justice, and morality. To suggest otherwise is a dangerous and irresponsible oversimplification of a complex issue. Let's not allow the misinterpretations of a few to tarnish the wisdom of the many. These texts are not weapons, but rather tools that can be used for either construction or destruction, and we must not allow those who seek to destroy to define their true potential.
My opponent tries to deflect by saying these are just possibilities, like a blueprint for a weapon. But let me break this down for you. Imagine you're given a blueprint not just for a weapon but for a torture device, complete with detailed instructions on how to inflict maximum suffering. And the instructions are not just in the footnotes, they're in the main text, they're the central narrative. Are we really going to pretend that the blueprint is harmless just because it's a possibility? This isn't about misinterpretation, this is about the very nature of the instructions themselves. It's like a cookbook that has a recipe for a cake that has instructions on how to make the cake poisonous and tells you it's your choice to use the poison. Do we really think the cake is harmless just because it can be interpreted differently? No. We recognize that the cookbook itself has a dangerous recipe. The other side's reliance on cherry-picked statistics is a desperate attempt to muddy the waters. They cite some study claiming that only a small percentage of terrorist attacks are religiously motivated. But here's the part that will blow your mind. Even if only some violence is directly religiously motivated, the severity and brutality of that violence are often directly linked to the dehumanizing narratives found in many holy books. Furthermore, a 2022 study by the Council on Foreign Relations found that religiously motivated conflicts are more likely to be protracted and result in higher casualties than conflicts motivated by other factors. This isn't a coincidence, it's a direct result of the zero-sum us versus them mentality that these texts so often promote. The issue isn't just the quantity of violence but the quality and the justification of that violence. Furthermore, this idea that these texts promote peace is laughable in the face of the historical record. These books don't just passively allow for violence, they actively create the conditions for it. They establish a clear distinction between believers and non-believers, often portraying the latter as enemies who deserve to be subjugated or even exterminated. The opposition points to passages about love and compassion, but let's be honest, those messages are often conditional, limited to the in-group, while the out-group is demonized and targeted for violence. It's like a company that claims to be ethical but only treats its shareholders well while exploiting its workers. Are we really going to ignore the blatant hypocrisy? Truth is, these texts are often used as weapons, as justifications for the most horrific acts of violence and oppression throughout history. They've been used to justify crusades, inquisitions, genocides, and countless other atrocities. To pretend that they are fundamentally peaceful is to turn a blind eye to the reality of the violence they have inspired and continue to inspire. The claim that holy books are inherently peaceful is not just intellectually dishonest, it's a dangerous betrayal of those who have suffered under their violent influence. Let's not be naive. Let's not be afraid to confront the truth. The evidence is overwhelming. Many holy books are fundamentally violent, and we must acknowledge this if we are ever to move toward a more peaceful world. These texts are not just words on a page, they are weapons of mass destruction in the hands of those who seek to justify violence and oppression.
All right, folks, round 3 just wrapped up and things are getting spicy. The negative side, arguing against the inherent violence of holy books, came out swinging with a strong analogy, the scalpel. They said, it's not the tool, it's the wielder. Clever, right? They tried to dismantle the blueprint analogy, emphasizing that a blueprint is just a possibility, not a command. They then threw down some statistics, claiming that only a small percentage of terrorism is religiously motivated, which is a bold move. This side is really leaning into the it's not the book, it's the people narrative. But hold on, because the affirmative side, arguing for the inherent violence, came back with a vengeance. They dismissed the peaceful interpretations as whitewashing and declared that the violence is a direct result of toxic instructions within the texts. They countered the blueprint analogy by saying, imagine a blueprint for a torture device, not just a weapon. They really hammered home the idea that the instructions themselves are the problem, not just how they're interpreted. And they didn't let those stats slide, arguing that even if some violence is religiously motivated, the brutality is often directly linked to these texts. Citing a study about the severity of religiously motivated conflict, they ended with a powerful statement, claiming these books are weapons of mass destruction, and calling the other side's argument a betrayal. That's some serious heat. Now let's break this down. The negative side had a solid start with strong analogies, but their reliance on statistics felt a little too easy to counter. The affirmative side, on the other hand, came back with a more targeted attack, really focusing on the nature of the texts and the severity of the violence they can inspire. They didn't just poke holes in the other side's arguments. They actively built a case for the texts being inherently violent. This round was a nail-biter, but the affirmative side, with their stronger counterarguments and focus on the core issues, just barely edged out the win. They were more persuasive in this round,